My name is Kristen Green, and I'm in my final semester in the pursuit of obtaining a master's degree as a reading specialist. For my reading research class, I decided to complete my book study presentation on the book Reading Don't Fix No Chevys because the main idea of this book correlates with my research project in this semester. My research question is, how can we motivate students to increase their reading comprehension? I would like to begin my book study with a discussion. Take a look at this picture. To me, this is a typical classroom. You can see this at the elementary level as well as the secondary level. So my question for you to think about is, when looking at this picture, what do you see? You might notice the girl in the front who is actively engaged. She's ready to answer the questions presented to her or share her feelings on whatever the teacher is addressing. The girls on the back in the back are not as engaged as the girl in the front, but it appears that they are attempting to do their work. However, you have the boy sitting up front with his head down, eyes closed, not engaged at all. My next questions are, why are these students acting the way that they are? And have you seen this in a classroom before? The book Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, Literacy in the Lives of Young Men by Michael W. Smith and Jeffrey D. Wilhelm ventures to study that why question. Why do males appear like this in classrooms? What is it that teachers are doing and not doing to disengage students in literacy activities? Now, let's dive into the book. Introduction. Two very concerned teachers. What the research says, and we'll address this a little bit more in the chapter 1 slide. Basically, the research shows that boys learn to read later than girls and they never catch up. This is particularly true in reading novels and extended forms of narratives, the types of texts that count the most in school. When I was conducting additional research, my findings mimic that of the research presented in this book. Since reading begins at the elementary level, this achievement gap is particularly critical in the primary years. In Gender Differences in Early Literacy, Skinner, Bellow, Farrington, and Sorrell found that research findings suggest, relative to girls, boys have weaker reading skill development when they enter kindergarten, and these differences either remain constant or increase during elementary school. Furthermore, according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation in their article titled Early Warning Why Reading by the End of Third Grade Matters, failure to read proficiently by third grade is linked to higher rates of school dropout, which suppresses individual earning potential as well as the nation's competitiveness and general productivity. If students begin kindergarten behind, particularly male students, and are not at grade level by the end of third grade, studies show that they will never catch up. While all of these things are true, the author makes it clear that sometimes research can paint a picture with too broad of a brush. Sometimes research makes generalizations that aren't always true. The purpose of this study was to go past those generalizations and to truly understand and take a close look at a wide variety of adolescent boys, to observe and talk with them about their literate activities both in and outside of school. To draw their conclusions, the authors of this book worked at 4 different sites in 3 states, working with 49 adolescent boys total from diverse backgrounds. They collected 4 kinds of data, which were qualitative in nature: informant ranking, interviews, reading profiles, and reading logs, which will be described more in depth later in the presentation. To get us thinking about the learning styles of boys and that achievement gap between boys and girls I just described, I would like to do an activity. These are generalizations derived from previous research on the differences between boys and girls. This is found in Chapter 1 of the book. We will be doing a sorting exercise in groups. We will complete the sorting exercise in a graphic organizer known as a T-chart. There are 4 categories that we will be looking at. These include achievement, attitude, choice, and response. I would like for you to create 4 T-charts labeled with one of each of the categories. One side of the T-chart will be for girls, and the other side will be for boys. On the next slides in the PowerPoint, you will read each bullet. You will then decide if the sentence on the bullet is typically something a boy or a girl would do or be interested in. Then write the sentence in the corresponding part of the T-chart. After you do that, we will check it. We will start with achievement. These are the generalizations that you will either put on the boy side or the girl side. Read less. Better information retrieval and work-related tasks. Comprehends narratives and expository text better. Takes longer to read. This is what research found in terms of achievement between girls and boys. Girls typically comprehend narratives and expository text better, whereas boys take longer to read less, and are better at information retrieval and work-related tasks. The next category is attitude. Here are the generalizations. Value leisure reading more. Declare themselves non-readers. Spend more time reading. Provide lower estimations in reading ability. Value reading less. And show more enthusiasm in reading. This is what research shows in terms of attitude. Girls typically value leisure reading more and spend more time reading and are more enthusiastic in reading, whereas boys provide lower estimations in their reading abilities, value reading less, and declare themselves non-readers more. The next category is choice. Here are the generalizations. Like to read about hobbies. Read more fiction. Do not resist reading stories based on sex. More inclined to read informational text. More inclined to read graphic novels and comic books. Enjoy reading poetry more. Here are the research findings in terms of choice. Girls typically read more fiction, do not resist reading stories based on sex, and enjoy reading poetry more, whereas boys are more inclined to reading informational text, are more inclined to read graphic novels and comic books, and boys also like to read about hobbies. Our last category is response, and here are the generalizations. The appearance of the book is extremely important. More likely to talk about their readings. Prefer active responses and making something. In terms of response, this is what research typically shows. Girls generally are more likely to talk about their readings, whereas boys, they think that the appearance of the book is extremely important and they prefer active responses and making something. This is a summary of the T-charts that you created based on the different categories of achievement, attitude, choice, and response. Once again, these can be found in Chapter 1 of the text. Chapter 1, What's Going Down? A review of the current concerns around boys and literacy. Like I mentioned before, Smith and Wilhelm do an excellent job in the literature review section of the book. Chapter 1 focuses on past and present studies on boys and literacy. Studies on boys and literacy. ETS, as cited in Cole, 1997, states that the largest gender gap is in literacy. The International Association for Evaluation of Education, 1985, found that gender was the biggest impact on achievement, and females outscored males on all writing tasks. The current framing of the issue follows what is known as the New Boys Movement. This movement stresses the perception that boys are in trouble both in and out of school, creating the phrase, boys will be boys. This perception is believed to be hindering boys' performances because of the expectations presented for them by the public. Boys assume that they will get away with more, and they act accordingly. While all of these findings remain true, the critical question is why? Why does this gender gap exist? Why are boys in trouble? Researchers have conducted studies to determine this answer. In a study conducted by Martino, 1998, he concluded that boys see literacy as feminized. Cherlin, Osment, and Millard conclude in their studies that boys' reading tendencies mimic that of what they observe. Additionally, most of the people that they see reading are female, supporting what Martino concluded. Millard's critical theory is also addressed in Chapter 1 of the text. Critical theory can make the ways we are gendered, our social attitude, and how we consider and use literacy as part of our classroom project something to be examined. Miller concludes through this theory that boys are disadvantaged in academic literacy as a result of current curricular emphasis, teacher text and topic choices, and lack of availability of texts that match their interests and needs. These understandings are crucial for our work as classroom teachers in reaching male students. While the research is there and is valid, the authors, Smith and Wilhelm, convey their concerns about this existing research. They fear that current research essentializes and oversimplifies students, loses sight of individuals, and has a narrow vision of success for these students. To address these fears in their research, the authors reiterate the importance of getting to know your own students. They suggest personality profiles, surveys, etc. to know how to reach your students. Before we begin our next slide on Chapter 2, I would like for us to create a concept web to organize the information to be presented in the rest of the book. We will address the contents of the concept web in the next slide. I would like for you to create your concept web based on Csikszentmihalyi's concepts of flow. These include control and competence, challenge at appropriate level, clear goals and feedback, and focus on immediate. Chapter 2, Going with the Flow, What Boys Like to Do and Why They Like to Do It. The lens in which this study was conducted was through Csikszentmihalyi's study on flow. Flow is the state in which nothing else matters. To get a better understanding of how the male participants in the study experienced flow, the authors had them complete an activity ranking sheet. Here, they ranked 14 items from what they most enjoyed doing to what they least enjoyed doing, and this can be found on page 29 of the text. This could easily be incorporated in any classroom to guide instruction and to determine what causes flow with your students. Csikszentmihalyi, 1990, flow experiences can be collapsed into four main principles: a sense of control and competence, a challenge that requires an appropriate skill level, clear goals and feedback, and a focus on the immediate. As I briefly address each one, add information to your concept web. I will explain these more in detail in Chapter 4 slide. The first is a sense of control and competence. Competence is a feeling of adequacy, meaning that you feel you are knowledgeable in whatever task you are doing. The boys in this study talked often about how they had a feeling of competence and how this kept them involved in an activity. Control is when students feel in charge of their learning by being provided choices. The next is a challenge that requires an appropriate level of skill. Csikszentmihalyi quotes that enjoyment comes at a very specific point, whenever the opportunities for the action perceived by the individual are equal to his or her capabilities. This means that the content is neither too difficult nor too hard. The next element of flow is clear goals and feedback. Clear goals and feedback are connected to the two elements just described. Students must know their focus and be given feedback in the process frequently. Students need to be aware of what they are doing, why they are doing it, and how they are doing in the process. Lastly, a focus on the immediate experience. The boys in this study enjoyed the activities that they did because it gave them immediate engagement. This, in turn, increases intrinsic motivation. Like I mentioned previously, these will be more explained in Chapter 4. In addition to these findings, Smith and Wilhelm, in their own studies, noticed additional similarities in their participants. They determined that the following things were important to their lives and thus their education: being social, being able to get away, activities, and avoiding the routine. With that being said, I would like to post another discussion question here. How can we make school less schoolish so that it is more engaging for our students and enables them to experience flow? Chapter 3, Do the Right Thing, the Instrumental Value of School and Reading. In research methodology, triangulation is the attempt to derive conclusions based on trying varieties and testing them against each other. In their study, Smith and Wilhelm created profiles for their participants to read and answer questions about. These profiles fit specific stereotypes that they were studying. The primary conclusion was that all boys believed that school was important and valued reading. However, where schools tend to be future directed, going against flow, the pleasure of learning and the pleasure of reading were not things that they focused on. In terms of masculinities, the boys admired the profile of the boy for what his reading brought him, which was the opposite of what the authors originally thought when they created that profile. In terms of race, none of the African American students agreed with the profile and that reading material made them feel white. Lastly, in terms of class, the boys realized that this can have an impact on their achievement. However, they knew that if their belief in school was strong, they could surpass the issues ahead of them. Their motivation, however, was lacking. In the discussion in the previous slide, I asked, how do we make reading and school not schoolish? According to Just Plain Folks, they suggest in order to do that, we need to make learning purposeful, make learning take place in a new context, provide assistance within context to meet a shared goal, and make learning immediately applied to the context. In this chapter, the authors also express the importance of front-loading. Front-loading activities are used before learning to determine specific knowledge on given topics. Front-loading correlates with the schema theory in that there can be little to no comprehension if students have no prior knowledge on the topic. Chapter 4, Mostly Outside, Rarely Inside, Situations that Promote Literacy. As stated before, the authors used qualitative assessments to draw their data. One such activity was the reading logs. The authors had the boys keep a daily literacy log of their literate activities. They met up and discussed their logs every 4 to 6 weeks. The main finding that was derived from this was the stark difference between the literacy that boys enjoyed at home versus what they experienced at school. After analyzing all of the logs, the authors found that the codes and subcodes from the study correlated once again with the theory of flow. I'll go a little bit more in detail about the flow components, so you might want to add some more to your concept web. The first is competence. Competence was crucial for boys of this study. On page 97 of the text, the authors claim that this was demonstrated by the boys through their admiration for the literate work of others and their expressed desire to enter into that community of competence. The downside to this is that boys tend to not try if they feel like they are not going to be successful. The boys felt that the teacher's role should be as an assistant in helping them become competent in literacy. Learning activities and environments should also be conducive in providing competence. It mentions in the book that hands-on, problem-centered work is valued just as much as the teacher. The next is control. The next flow element suggested by the reading logs is control. So since Mahaly states that acquiring knowledge controlled from the outside brings no joy, boys in this study felt that school denied them of choice. Thus, without choice, students were not interested in their learning. Students need instruction that caters to their interests and allows them to self-select their topics and their learning. Technology was also addressed in this section. In the 21st century, technology skills are a must for the real world. However, technology utilization in schools was superficial to the boys, but they enjoyed it at home. The next is challenge. In addition to those elements of flow, the level of challenge was also addressed through the use of logs. Students sought a challenge at an appropriate level. Vygotsky's zone of proximal development correlates with this idea in that students should work within an area that is challenging enough but not too difficult. That way, it is not only challenging, but students feel competent in completing the task. The authors provide information on why the students thought they could not meet the challenges posed by the schools. These include ambiguity, meaning they felt unclear of their expectations, length, the boys were turned off if the reading was too long, style, students felt that the language of the text was old-fashioned, and unfamiliarity. The text structures were not understood by the boys or were something that they couldn't relate to. Clear goals and feedback. Lastly, through the reading logs, the impact of clear goals and feedback was evident. The major problem in schools is that children do not understand the purpose of specific drills and lessons. Most boys in this study equated doing assignments to getting grades instead of a bigger picture. The readings that the boys did outside of school always had a purpose, as should what they read in school. Some examples of works they enjoy reading are those that enable them to figure things out, are realistic, and are game-like. Lastly, this chapter presents a question. How can we provide the kind of assistance in becoming competent without taking too much control? Smith and Wilhelm suggest making reading visible, and that teachers' role is to make their thinking and reading processes visible to students to support their students' learning. They suggest using the I do, we do, you do format to teaching, which provides gradual release of control. The next chapter, Chapter 5, addresses the text that boys enjoy reading. For a discussion, I would like to ask you, what are student interests in your area and texts that your students enjoy reading that could guide your instruction? Chapter 5, May I have the envelope, please? The texts boys enjoy and why they enjoy them. On the first page of this chapter, this quote stood out to me. Sex accounts for much greater differences in interest than does age or intelligence. This was said by Thorndike. Like we saw in the sorting exercise at the beginning of this PowerPoint, boys and girls have different interests in their readings. However, in traditional classrooms, they are expected to complete the same tasks. In this chapter, Smith and Wilhelm analyzed the reading logs a little closer and analyzed the boys' reaction to stories to determine what interests them and to determine what text they most enjoy. Here's what was concluded from the reading logs. A focus on the immediate was crucial for boys' success, which is the last element of flow. The social aspect was the most important way to make experiences immediate and enjoyable. Family members and friends influenced the text selection that boys chose because it made the text connected to their lives rather in an active or a passive way. However, sadly enough, teachers usually are not in the social network for boys. In engaging in literate activities, it has to be something that boys are passionate about. This provides the occasion for social connections and intrinsic motivation for male students. The use of technology also facilitated social interactions amongst the boys. They participated in instant messaging, electronic chat rooms, and emails. As important as focusing on the social aspect of reading was incorporating engaging material. Such materials included music, texts that are storied, texts that are exportable, texts that sustain engagement, texts that are novel or different, and texts that are funny. The remainder of Chapter 5 focused on the findings derived by the boys' responses to short stories. Smith and Wilhelm created short stories and had the boys respond to each of the stories by reading aloud and stating anything that came to their minds. They then characterized the general approach the boys took to each of the stories. These include information-driven, story-driven, point-driven, association-driven, evaluation-driven, experience-driven, and disengaged reading. You can see on this slide what each one means. And looking closely at the boys' readings and how they responded, Smith and Wilhelm found that story-driven readings were dominant. In this type of orientation, the boys seem to treat the characters as artistic creations that they not need to care about, which is a concern for teachers. Students cannot make a connection with a character or a text if they do not view them as relevant or valuable. So, how do we cultivate a concern for characters for our students? Smith and Wilhelm suggest using front-loading exercises where you activate background knowledge or get your students engaged from the get-go. One way to do this is to simulate the conflict that a character faces before students begin reading. This makes learning hands-on and engaging for the students. Students must relate to the character in order to enjoy and comprehend the text. Boys enjoy reading about characters who participate in the same activities and have similar interests as them. The final chapter of this book is titled A Profound Challenge: Implications for Classroom Teachers. Smith and Wilhelm ask that we rethink the fundamentals of teaching in their final chapter. They suggest redefining literacy in semiotic terms, semiotic being the study of all meaning-making signs. This would mean for teachers to incorporate music, video, visual arts, and electronic technologies in their instruction to reach students. Additionally, students must have teachers that care for them. However, unlike most things, this is something that cannot be taught in college or graduate classes. Teachers must exhibit their love of teaching and love of learning to their students for them to be successful as well. Throughout this presentation, there have been different instructional techniques brought up that cater to all students, both male and female. In this chapter, the authors note how crucial inquiry is for male students. This type of learning encourages the kind of problem solving that the male students found motivating. An inquiry framework provides a meaningful context for us to instruct our students. It also correlates with all elements of flow, which we have previously discussed. As far as the selection of text, Smith and Wilhelm urge the incorporation of texts that are not too difficult but are challenging enough for students to be engaged. This correlates with the flow element of competence. Students also need to be exposed to shorter text, which allows for more in-depth discussions and more perspectives to be addressed. Texts that are humorous also appeal to boys. Humorous texts allow students to experience enjoyment in the immediate, which will drastically increase their engagement. As we've brought up numerous times already, lastly, in terms of text selection, students must be provided with opportunities for choice. As a teacher, this means we need to work harder to offer more choices in reading as well as free time to read in the classroom. This could also mean that students are provided with book clubs where students discuss shared books with one another. This chapter closes with a section on how we should teach, which stresses the importance of front-loading and making reading social, two ideas already discussed in this presentation. Front-loading exercises assist in building background knowledge and making learning relevant. Students need to know what they are doing and why they are doing it so they can obtain flow. Social experiences help provide intrinsic motivation to students, something that is hard to build for some readers, especially those that struggle. Inquiry projects help establish this by enabling students to work together to reach a common goal. The authors state that literacies grow out of relationships, and as teachers, we must provide opportunities for this to occur. The greatest thing we can do is to establish a home-school connection where students are as passionate about their learning at school as they are with their readings and activities at their homes. So we will conclude this book study presentation with this. Think about what all we discussed today. Think about how you can change the atmosphere from the classroom to the left to make it the classroom on the right. After viewing the pictures of the two classrooms in the last slide, please complete this graphic organizer to express what you learned through this book presentation. Please write down 3 things you learned, 2 strategies that you plan to incorporate in your classroom to keep your students motivated, and 1 question that you still have. This last slide is my works cited page. I primarily used the book Reading Don't Fix No Chevys, Literacy in the Lives of Young Men. However, I incorporated additional research that I did on my own from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, as well as from Bellow, Skinner, Farrington, and Sorrell. I also referenced Vygotsky's Zone of Proximal Development. I obtained my images from Google Images. The graphic organizers that I used include the T-Charts, Concept Web, and Exit Slip. And my activities included a sorting exercise, the exit slip, and the numerous discussion posed throughout the presentation.